It would be a mistake to hear the parable of the Good Samaritan and not focus on the context in which Jesus tells his story. An expert in the law, a lawyer, comes to Jesus and asks a big question. What do I have to do, essentially, to get to heaven, to be with God forever, to experience eternal life? Tell me what I gotta do. Just summarize it in simplistic terms so that I know I can check off the boxes and I know that I'm in. Jesus turns it around from, you're an expert in law. What do you read in the Torah? What do you read in the law? And this guy dazzles. He pulls out of Deuteronomy, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength, the Shema. And he pulls out of Leviticus, and love your neighbor as yourself. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is talking to a crowd of people, and he says, all the law, all the prophetic teachings hinge upon these two things. Do these things and you'll have life. Jesus says, nailed it. Do that, and you will live with God eternally. But it says in some translations, the lawyer wants to vindicate himself. The lawyer wants to justify himself. Who exactly do you mean? Who is my neighbor? Is the question that prompts Jesus to tell this story. Now, this story, the parable of the Good Samaritan, is so familiar. I would say between it and the prodigal son, if you grew up in a church or you went to Sunday school or you've been to church at any time in your life, you've probably heard a sermon or teaching on the parable of the Good Samaritan. It is super familiar to us. We have it referenced in books and in movies. We have a hospital named after it just down the road. We even have laws, Good Samaritan laws in many states. If you find somebody incapacitated or unresponsive, you can do some life-saving measures. In most states, they will, if you mess something up or if you make a mistake, so that you can't be sued under Good Samaritan laws. The definition of a Good Samaritan is somebody who shows compassion, especially to somebody who's a stranger, who they don't know, but they do the right thing even when nobody else is around to notice. That's how we hear the term Good Samaritan. But in first century Palestine, there is no such thing as a Good Samaritan. There is a divide hard and fast between Samaritans and Jews. If you remember Jesus' story from John's gospel where he meets the woman at the well, and she says, how is it that you, a Jew, can ask me, a Samaritan, for a drink of water? And it says in parentheses, because Jews and Samaritans don't associate with each other. And then she says, I know you're a prophet, but you Jews say we have to worship in Jerusalem, and we worship on our own mountain here. There's this lack of intermingling. As if you were here Ash Wednesday, I apologize, a little bit of a recap. But so there's 12 tribes of Israel, right? And King David, then King Solomon, his son. Solomon builds all these big projects. That he builds the first temple to God. He builds his palace, which, by the by, is bigger than the temple to God. And a palace to his wife. And all these building projects are paid for by the people. Taxes, you're right. And Solomon bleeds the people dry. And by the way, if you read carefully in 1 and 2 Samuel, Solomon also does something the law forbids. He gets forced labor. That's a nice way of saying he enslaves his own people. You remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Be kind to the slaves. Never enslave another Jewish person because you know what it is to be oppressed and to be slaves. Well, Solomon, in all of his wisdom and splendor, fudges the rules. So when Solomon dies and his son, Rehoboam, is about to take the kingship, the people of the north, the northern tribes, the 10 of them, and the people in the south, the 2 southern tribes, gather to hear what this new king, this new prince, is going to do. And I think the people in the north especially are hopeful that he will be a reformer, that he will be easier than his father. But instead he says, in my little finger, I have more power than my father ever did. And he lashed you with whips, quite literally. I'll lash you with scorpions. Kind of a rough inauguration speech. And the people in the north, the cousins, the blood cousins of the people in the south say, forget you guys. And Israel is no more. It divides into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And the people in the north, who are the future, the past descendants, the ancestors of what we will call the Samaritans, say, we don't accept your priests. We're not going to worship in Jerusalem. It's not our holy city. It's yours, you southerners. We're not going to accept the kingly line and the blessing of David. We'll get our own kings. Thank you very little. And we'll have nothing to do with you southerners except hold some of the same Torah law. So we've got, very similar than some of you remember in the 1990s, we have both political and faith division between northern and southern Irish, Catholic and Protestant Irish, some who want to be part of the United Kingdom, some who don't. And so there's a very violent divide. And again, we don't have that in our country's history. Between north and south, left and right. All right, so there's these divisions. And my point is, for Jesus to use this example of a Samaritan would be the farthest. Samaritans are used as slurs and as jokes. They don't like each other. They've fought wars together. They don't associate together. So it's shocking that he used the example of a Samaritan as the hero of the story, especially, again, if you were here at Ash Wednesday, to his own disciples, because Jesus and the guys and women who have followed him just tried to stop in a Samaritan village. And what did the Samaritans do for Jesus? Did they welcome him with open arms? They said, no, you're going to Jerusalem. We'll have nothing to do with Jerusalem, so get out of here. We want nothing to do with you, prophet from the south. And James and John, in their great understanding and compassion, said, Lord, can we call down some fire? How about a little fire, Scarecrow? Can we call down some fire from heaven and smite these guys? Can we just ask God to destroy them, to wipe them off the face of the planet? And in that moment, Jesus doubles down on both telling them to stop hating on the Samaritans who've just cast them out and been unhospitable to them. But he also calls them into a deeper individual calling of discipleship. Listen, knock this off. If you're going to follow me, this is what it looks like. So the lawyer comes to Jesus. Who matters? Who's my neighbor? And Jesus tells his story. Now, we grew up hearing and preaching and teaching that the story of the Good Samaritan is basically be a good neighbor to people in need. That a person who's alone at Thanksgiving, you should invite them maybe to your house or your celebration. The elderly person who is widowed down your street, maybe you cut their lawn or you visit them, get them groceries. To somebody who is homeless on the side of the road with a sign, you look for your change or some food and try to help a stranger in need. That's what being a good neighbor is, right? Yeah. And those are great things. But let's dig into the story a little and see some of the things that might have some real shock value to them. A man decides to go from Jerusalem down to Jericho. Why so specific? Wouldn't any road in Palestine do? Guy's on the road and he gets jumped by bandits. Why this road? Well, Jerusalem is the head of the holy, it's the holy center of Judaism, right? It's where the temple is. It's the shiny city on the hill. It is the place where God resides. But you go down the dangerous, nearly 4-mile road, and if you've ever been to Israel, some of you have, it's really desolate. You're going down towards the Dead Sea, Jericho. It's a winding road. It looks almost in some places like you're walking on the moon. There's just not a lot there. There are a lot of caves, a lot of valleys. And it was a dangerous road in the ancient world. Not that most roads weren't dangerous, but it was a place that was well known that you shouldn't travel alone and should use some common sense and not maybe be flashy on the road, right? So you and I would say there's certain areas of the country, there's probably certain neighborhoods that you would not walk alone maybe at any time of day, or certainly by yourself at night. Common sense, you might be careful in an area that is known for more violence or crime rate. Same kind of mentality around the road down to Jericho. So why are all these guys walking by themselves? Seems kind of odd. Jesus would say that common sense, but none of these guys seem to have it. The first man is jumped, beaten, and left for dead. And then this priest comes along. And growing up, I always thought, okay, here's a guy who's supposed to help, right? You think, here's somebody who is supposed to be really a leader of faith. They're supposed to be tied to their faith. And so instead, he avoids the man who's been left for dead, even though he sees him, and he should stop to help. But maybe he has obligations in the temple, maybe he has people to go see, or maybe, just maybe, he's being cautious. I mean, how many of you ever seen like a Western where there's like, or a modern day show where somebody pulls the car over and the hood's up and there's somebody in distress, but really there's people who are already hiding on the side of the road. So when the person stops to go help, they'll get bushwhacked or ambushed. I don't know if this guy's dead or not. He looks wounded, but he also looks like, very clearly, he's been attacked. So where are the robbers? If I go approach him, let down my guard, I might be attacked on this dangerous road too. He's being practical in some sense, maybe. And what the heck is a Levite? Does it have anything to do with Levi jeans? No. So a Levite is from the tribe of Levi. It's from the books of law. Levites were supposed to care for the holy articles in the temple or holy articles of worship. So deacons, people who might prepare communion or baptism, or people who take care of the sacrifices in temple along with the priests. They're not actually doing the sacrifices, but they're caring for the utensils and things that are used for that. So again, a person who's assumed to be a holy person. Both groups, people of power, people of position, a who's who in Jerusalem crowds, neighbors who matter, who are beneficial to me to know them. And then Jesus has the audacity to say, here comes a Samaritan. By the way, a Samaritan who has a donkey, who has olive oil, who has wine, and who has some coin in his purse. Talk about who's not traveling very wisely on a dangerous road. Who has a lot to lose. But the Samaritan stops, and you know the story. He helps the man, he bandages his wounds, he gets off his donkey and does something. Think about that for a second. And there it is. Right side gets it. All right, anyway. And as he's coming back to the inn, he says, I'll put all his medical expenses on my tab, whatever he rings up. And as they're standing there, as Jesus is telling this story to his disciples and to the lawyer, he asks the lawyer which one was a good neighbor to the man. That's not the question the lawyer asked, is it? This whole story isn't really the question that the lawyer asked. And lawyers are particular about language. Who is my neighbor? Jesus doesn't tell him who his neighbor is. Jesus is telling a story about being a neighbor. The lawyer is worried about who matters. As he's thinking philosophically, he's engaged in and a hypothetical question about the law and its purpose on how to get to heaven. Who do I need? How do I interpret this law? And Jesus turns it and says, you need to be a neighbor. Be a good neighbor. You're asking the wrong question. You, like the disciples who wanted to destroy their enemies, this is what it takes to be a disciple. You guys, stop judging. Stop trying to destroy your enemies. Come follow me. In this case, stop asking who matters, and you be a person who is deeply compassionate to everybody around you. Notice that the lawyer can't even say the Samaritan as his answer. It's pretty easy. Jesus has been talking about the Samaritan through the whole story. But he says, I suppose it's the one, the gentleman, he doesn't use that term either, and he wouldn't have. I suppose it's the one who showed mercy. Go do it, Jesus tells him. In Ann Arbor, Michigan, home of a university up north for people from Ohio. It's a great school. It's a great school. Is that on tape? There was a Ku Klux Klan rally. White supremacists came out, met by thousands of counter-protesters, and a particular group of Black Lives Matters folks and KKK folks, and it got heated. And somebody in the African-American crowd noticed that there was a man wearing a Confederate flag t-shirt and had white supremacist tattoos. And they turned on this man who was on the wrong side of the fence where his people were versus their people, us and them. And they began to chase this man down, started to beat him with signs, knock him to the ground, and start to punch him. And an 18-year-old African-American woman named Keisha Thomas threw her body over this man and told her fellow folks in her group to stop, as the blows meant for him hit her. And she wasn't telling them to stop hitting her, she was telling them to stop hurting this man, who had a vastly different ideology than her, who likely, don't know, but likely, because of the things that he was there for, saw her and her skin color, her people, in his eyes, radically different and less than, I imagine, people with his own color skin, if he's standing with the things that were symbols on his body. Her enemy, much like Jews and Samaritans were enemies. And she became a human shield, telling people to stop. When Keisha Thomas, then 18, was later interviewed in her mid-20s, she said, I know what it is to be mistreated and to have people do ugly things to you. And in that moment, I saw people who were there with me at the rally, who were my friends, turning that hate inward towards this man. We were there to talk against hatred and things that were against us, but then we were doing the same thing to him. And I didn't want anybody to get hurt, and I wanted us to stop. He didn't deserve that. Though she had reached out to meet with a man following this incident, it was covered in the news, it was covered in lots of magazines and papers. The man who was attacked never reached back. But one day, a true story, one day when she was in a coffee shop, a young man came up to her and said, I want to thank you. And she said, thank you for what? And he said, that man was my father that you protected. And I want to thank you what you did for my dad. But I also want to tell you that the things he stood for ended there. And I don't agree with why he was there. And my sister and I want to thank you for the kindness that you showed to our family. Be a good neighbor. The lawyer, like us, or maybe not you, it's probably not you, but certainly like me, I want to ask Jesus, who counts? Which of those folks, I'm sorry, I'm not pointing at you guys, which of those folks matter? And do I really have to be compassionate to them? Can't I just be compassionate to people I like, people who agree with me, people who are on my side of things? And Jesus tells us a story. Who has mercy? You're asking the wrong question. Be a good neighbor. Amen.